Harrison and I fell out only because I was the new kid on the block in Hollywood, and I had never shot in Hollywood before, so that was my first film in Hollywood. And by that time, I'm 42 years old.
Imagine creating a film so groundbreaking it reshaped science fiction forever, and still walking away filled with regret. That's exactly what happened to Ridley Scott. The man behind Alien and Gladiator once called this film one of his greatest creative achievements. Yet behind the scenes, it was a war zone. Constant fights, conflicting visions, and one actor, he says, nearly ruined it all. The real story behind this iconic movie isn't just about futuristic cities and replicants. It's about a director pushed to the edge by the very person meant to bring his vision to life. And even decades later, Ridley Scott hasn't let it go. When Ridley Scott agreed to direct Blade Runner, he wasn't just making another sci-fi movie, he was building a future that had never been seen on screen before: neon-lit decay, philosophical undertones, and haunting questions about humanity. This was never meant to be a crowd pleaser. It was personal, and that's exactly where the problems started. The project was already on shaky ground. The original script was messy, the themes were dense, and the budget kept creeping higher. Scott's vision was clear, but it clashed almost instantly with the expectations of the studio, who wanted something more marketable, more digestible, more Hollywood. Enter Harrison Ford. The studio loved him. After Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ford was box office gold. For them, he was the perfect Deckard, cool, rugged, and bankable. But for Ridley Scott, that was the problem. Ford represented everything Scott was trying to avoid. He didn't want a hero. He wanted ambiguity, a man who could question his own existence, someone who could disappear into the role, not dominate it. Ford, in his eyes, was too big, too recognizable, and too confident. The studio didn't care. They pushed hard. And Scott, already exhausted by creative fights and grieving the recent death of his brother, gave in. Behind closed doors, he admitted it. Ford was never his first choice. In fact, he wasn't even second. Scott had considered actors like Dustin Hoffman, who would have brought a very different kind of energy, strange, intellectual, and untraditional. But that version of Blade Runner was never going to fly with executives focused on profit margins. Ford was the compromise, one that set the tone for everything that followed. And the moment filming began, it was clear this wasn't going to be easy. From the very first day on set, something felt off. Ridley Scott was meticulous, a director obsessed with atmosphere, lighting, and precision. Every frame mattered. Every detail had to serve the story. But Harrison Ford had his own ideas, and they didn't always align. Behind the camera, Scott demanded control. In front of it, Ford wasn't afraid to push back. The result? A working relationship defined by quiet resentment and occasional explosions. Ford later described the experience as frustrating, saying he often felt directionless, like he was playing a character no one fully understood, not even the director. Scott, meanwhile, viewed Ford as cold, detached, and sometimes outright difficult. They clashed over everything from dialogue to blocking to character motivation. What made it worse was the lack of communication. Ford wanted answers. Scott was focused on visuals. The two were speaking different languages, and neither was willing to translate. Crew members recalled an atmosphere that was intense and unpredictable. There weren't full-blown screaming matches, but there was tension in the air, thick, unspoken, and growing by the day. And as the production dragged on, that tension didn't fade. It escalated. Every disagreement chipped away at whatever creative trust had existed between them. And by the time filming wrapped, the damage was done. But the real conflict hadn't even started yet. When Blade Runner entered post-production, the studio panicked. Early test screenings were a disaster. Audiences found the plot too confusing, too slow, and too strange. So the suits stepped in. Their solution? A voiceover. They wanted Ford to narrate the story, to guide viewers through the complex world Scott had created. But to Scott, this was the ultimate betrayal. He saw the voiceover as clumsy, forced, and worst of all, insulting. Harrison Ford didn't like it either. In fact, he hated it. He's gone on record saying he found the narration unnecessary and awkward, and many fans believe he deliberately read it in a flat, uninterested tone to sabotage it. Whether that's true or not, the final product felt lifeless. It stripped the film of its mystery, spoon-feeding audiences what they were supposed to think, rather than letting them interpret it themselves. Scott was furious. He later blamed Ford for the robotic delivery, suggesting it helped ruin what was supposed to be a haunting, atmospheric story. And while the studio got what it wanted, a version of Blade Runner they thought audiences could understand, what they ended up with was a compromised vision, one of the most important sci-fi films ever made, watered down by a narration no one believed in. But Scott wasn't done fighting. Not even close. When Blade Runner hit theaters in 1982, it wasn't Ridley Scott's film. Not really. It was the studio's version, chopped, narrated, and re-edited without his full approval. The theatrical cut included the controversial voiceover, a happy ending Scott despised, and several scenes that softened the film's darker tone. Critics were divided, audiences were confused, and Scott was quietly devastated. But he wasn't about to let the film die that way. Over the years, Scott fought tooth and nail to reclaim his vision. It started small: conversations in interviews, hints about deleted scenes, comments about how different Blade Runner was supposed to be. Then, in 1992, something changed. Warner Brothers released the director's cut, removing the voiceover, ditching the fake happy ending, and restoring a more ambiguous, cerebral tone. It wasn't perfect, but it was closer to what Scott had imagined all along. Still, he wasn't satisfied. In 2007, after decades of fighting studios and regaining creative control, Ridley Scott finally released Blade Runner, the final cut, the only version he fully endorsed. No narration, no studio interference, just the moody, existential masterpiece he had set out to create. For many fans, this version revealed just how visionary Scott had been, and how far off the mark the original release really was. But the wounds from the original experience hadn't healed. In fact, they were just starting to scar. Despite the cult status Blade Runner earned over time, Ridley Scott never spoke about it with unfiltered pride. Instead, he often returned to one thing: regret. In interviews, he admitted that the studio interference, the fractured collaboration with Ford, and especially the forced narration, left him bitter. One comment stood out. When asked about the voiceover, he said, "I was so damn angry about that. It destroyed the rhythm of the film." And he didn't just blame the studio, he blamed Ford too. Scott believed Ford intentionally sabotaged the narration with a dull, unenthusiastic tone. Whether out of protest or spite, it felt, to Scott, like betrayal. He later claimed, "If you don't want to do it, don't do it. Don't tank it on purpose." The fallout from that decision haunted him for years. Even when the film was reevaluated and praised as a visionary triumph, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been tainted by compromise. The kind of compromise that no director ever forgets. And as Blade Runner slowly transformed from a box office disappointment to a cultural icon, Scott's relationship with it remained complicated. It was both a masterpiece and a missed opportunity. A film that defined a genre and nearly broke its creator in the process. Over time, something strange happened. The film Ridley Scott had nearly disowned became one of the most studied, referenced, and revered pieces of science fiction ever made. Directors like Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, and the Wachowskis cited it as inspiration. Artists, game designers, and futurists all borrowed from its look, its mood, and its philosophy. Blade Runner went from misunderstood to mythologized. But here's the irony. The version that built the legend wasn't the one most people saw in theaters. It took decades, multiple cuts, and constant fighting for Scott to reshape Blade Runner into what he had intended all along. And while the world came to embrace the film, even celebrate it, the scars from its creation never fully faded. Harrison Ford rarely spoke about it fondly. Scott remained bitter about the compromises he was forced to make. And fans, while grateful for the final product, could only wonder what might have been if the vision had been protected from the start. Even the sequel, Blade Runner 2049, brought back old feelings. Scott produced it, but didn't direct. Ford returned, older and more reflective. And though the film was praised, it reopened the emotional file for Scott, not just about the story, but about the pain that came with it. Blade Runner is a masterpiece, but not the kind that came easily. Behind every beautiful shot and iconic line is a storm of conflict, resentment, and regret. Ridley Scott poured his soul into a world the studio never fully understood. Anchored by a star he never truly clicked with. And even now, decades later, you can still hear it in his voice, that edge, that tension, when he talks about the film. It's a rare reminder that even the greatest works of art can be born from chaos, and that for some creators, success isn't measured in praise or legacy, but in the purity of the vision that got away. So the next time you watch Blade Runner, remember, what you're seeing isn't just a film. It's a fight, a compromise, and maybe, just maybe, a regret that never quite let go.